Hi, I'm David Kais, and I run R for the rest of us. You may think of R as a tool for complex statistical analysis, but it's much more than that. From data visualization to efficient reporting to improving your workflow, R can do it all. On this podcast, I talk with people about how they use R in unique and creative ways. I'm delighted to be joined today by Christine Parker. Christine is the solo data wrangler and map crafter for the Community Broadband Networks team at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Her work guides and supports the team's education and advocacy work related to internet access and digital equity across the United States. Christine uses R regularly for data wrangling tasks and creating geographic data sets that she can visualize in maps. Christine, welcome and thanks for joining me.
Hi, nice to be here. Thank you.
So you and I met because we were in speaker training for the 2024 Posit Conf. And your talk was particularly interesting to me because it was about how you used R to develop or as part of the development process for a map that showed access to the Affordable Connectivity Program. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Just I'll mention that it was a pandemic era program to help people get access to affordable internet, at a time when obviously everybody was working and going to school from home. So before we get into that program and kind of how the R work that you did fit into it, I'm curious if you can just give me kind of a brief sketch of your background and specifically kind of how you got into R.
Sure. So I went to grad school at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and there I wound up getting both my master's and PhD in natural resource and environmental science. Um, and I specifically focused on bird behavior. So I've had a major context change since then. But during my PhD, I really got into using R in more advanced ways. But initially, during my master's years, any kind of stats courses that were available were only teaching SAS, but there were other students that were using R, and it became like a sort of peer pressure, like these are the cool kids using R kind of situation. Like I could hear them commiserating about their struggles with learning and using R, and I was like, well, I want to be a part of that club. It also seemed to make more sense because it's an open source and it's free to use, and looking forward into, career stuff, it made sense to work with something that I could use on my own and practice outside of academia.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, in my PhD work, I was studying wild turkey behavior, and we put little GPS backpacks on wild turkeys, and it collected like
I'm
Fitbit
sorry for
data
laughing at your
essentially.
research. I'm just imagining little turkeys walking around with backpacks on. Sorry,
Yeah,
can you
I
just?
know.
I'll let you continue, but can you just? Is that actually what happened?
G Kind of. It's not like what you would consider a standard backpack, but
Uh,
it's like, a little black sensor that's, I don't know, like, not bigger than a standard cell phone at this point in time,
okay.
and it has, like, this elastic cording that it straps over their wings like a backpack would on your arms,
Okay.
and it holds it on their back, and so that is communicating with satellites, and it collects location data every 2 hours, and then it's also continuously collecting movement information, and so it generates huge data sets,
Wow.
and yeah, so it became really useful for me to get into the like spatial data side of working with R. So yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so sorry, I interrupted you.
Sorry,
Was
that was a big
distracted
sidetrack.
by turkey backpacks, so please continue.
um, so yeah, I was influenced by these other students using R, and because there were no courses on it, it was largely self-taught and like meeting with other students about like when I found out, this person was using this package, so they're the quasi expert around here. And then I also found out about the Swirl package, which I found immensely helpful. It's like an interactive teaching package built in that you can get for R, and it walks you through like kind of really basic stuff, but they have kind of more complicated advanced packages now, and they're really helpful. So I always recommend that for new folks, like when I have interns and um, but yeah, and then over time it just kind of progressed and I learned new things and yeah, here I am today.
So how did you move then from studying wild turkeys to working at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, doing, internet access work?
So I mentioned that the turkeys had these GPS units on it, and it was a massive, like, spatial geographic data set. And working with those kind of data and creating maps was really interesting to me and a lot of fun. And when I finished my PhD and was like looking at the job market, I started to consider that focusing on that side of my skill set would be probably a better path forward career wise than being kind of fixed in my like ecology
Hmm.
context. And so I wasn't like closed off to ecology, but I really wanted to kind of stay on this like map and GIS spatial data
Sure.
wrangling track.
And so you moved to the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Can you talk to me about, generally speaking, what your job there entails and how R fits into it?
Sure. So at the Institute, like I mentioned, I'm in the Community Broadband Networks initiative. And so we focus on advocating for locally owned and accountable internet networks, which also like advocating for affordable and reliable internet access. And so initially, when I started there, I was most frequently working with this massive data set that's managed by the FCC or the Federal Communications Commission. And this data set is now known as the Broadband Data Collection. At the time when I started, it was um, the data were aggregated at a census block level, which is a really small geography that the Census Bureau uses. Um, and R could handle that. I could pull in the whole data set for the whole country. By the way, rewind. This data set is represents claims of where any internet service provider could offer a particular kind of internet service. And so there's all kinds of information about like the type of service and what
Hmm.
technology is used. Um, but uh, they have to update this twice a year. And so it's at the time it was like a 20 gig size data set, and R could handle the whole thing. It would really bog down.
Sure.
But I was able to do everything I needed to. And then a couple years ago, they made this wonderful change and converted the data set into a location level data set, which is great because it's much more granular and you can really get some more nuanced insights about connectivity across the country. But it's massive now, and R is like, no, no, thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
uh, and so I've been using R a little bit less lately, only because I do a lot of the bigger wrangling. I have a PostgreSQL database that I kind of keep everything in and do some overarching like wrangling there, and then bring it into R. And so I use R as like kind of the fine tuning and creating like tables and plots and things like that. Um, but after being at the Posit conference, I learned about DuckDB, and I'm really interested to using the wrapper that they have for R. Unfortunately, I guess they don't have a Windows binary yet, so it's not working for me yet. But I look forward to that day.
Yeah, yeah. And so one thing that you've worked on in your time at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance is this affordable connectivity program. Can you describe its origins and kind of how your work at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, like how that began, how you began to do work on that program?
Yeah, so when the program came about, It had a bank account of like $14 billion, but it had no timeline. Like no one knew when it was meant to end. There were no like checkpoints along the way. We just knew there was this funding, and there was like eligibility characteristics. So a household could be eligible based on their income and a bunch of other ways. Um, but there was no good information about other than that, really. And I started to hear a lot of questions from my team, and then we started to get questions externally about the program. And because it's a federal program, there is a website where you can get access to all of the enrollment and claims data. So the providers would submit claims to the FCC based on like how many customers they have using this program. And then the FCC has a company that manages all this data and puts it on this website, and it is in many different formats, much to my dismay. And that's ultimately what gave me the idea to create a dashboard, because there were many different like geographies of data available, and there were different timelines for when these data sets were updated. And it was just really confusing to try and explain to anyone like what actually any of this meant without just summarizing it and creating some sort of a resource for folks to use that was more straightforward. Because pointing folks to this like, oh, you could look up your zip code in this CSV file maybe,
Mhm.
is not really particularly helpful. And the advocacy folks that we work with, especially those that are out in communities and helping people get signed up and dedicating their time and money on that kind of a effort, don't have the time to go and track down like what enrollment looks like in their
Sure.
city, because it would just be a real hassle.
And so the work that you did, was that about showing what programs are available for people who wanted to take advantage of them? Or was it showing how many people are taking advantage of the programs, or possibly both?
Yeah, so we wanted to highlight where enrollment was occurring, and also like the actual rate. Um, and the actual like eligibility was an important factor in all of this. And there ended up being kind of some like different variations of how you calculated that depending on who you talk to. Um, and and it became really important to be able to demonstrate like because you could look at enrollment across the country, but without knowing like how many folks were actually eligible, it's
Hmm,
not a terribly helpful
that's true.
number.
And so this dashboard, so it sounds like you the one, or other folks at your organization had the idea to make this dashboard?
Yeah, it was kind of a collaborative effort to go forward with that. And the dashboard, I think, it had been kind of a tentative suggestion at the time, because we really hadn't done anything quite like that yet. So it was exciting to see it actually
Yeah.
blow up like this.
Yeah, and well, not to cut to the chase, but in the end, it got, a ton of views, and you ended up, we'll come back to this, but you ended up speaking to folks at the White House about
Hmm.
the work that you had done. Yeah, so can you talk just at a high level about the role that R played? Because I know the dashboard itself, the presentation layer was actually done with Tableau, but
Hmm.
talk about the role that R played before getting to Tableau.
Yeah, so R was really helpful in a couple of big ways. One was taking all these different data sources and combining them, cleaning them, rearranging them, and then ultimately summarizing them into the different like values or elements that were displayed in that dashboard. And the other way was pulling data from the Census Bureau, because rather than like going to their website and then also navigating another federal website,
Sure.
there's a great package called Tidy Census that allows you to get access to those data in a really pretty straightforward and easy way. So those were kind of the big lifts that R helped me with on this project.
Yeah, and it seems like, having looked at the code, which we'll have you show in just a moment, a big part of this was being able to combine multiple data sources. Like you said, bringing in data from the Census Bureau alongside other data, and having it all in one place. It seems like that was a major benefit of doing all the data wrangling in R.
Yep.
Um, well, do you want to put your screen up and just kind of walk me through a bit of the code?
Sure.
Um,
All right.
okay, so we're now looking at the code. You wrote this. I can tell that obviously this is in an R Markdown document. Just out of curiosity, before we dive into the code, what led you to do it in an R Markdown document versus like an R script file or any other format?
Um, uh, that's a good question. I think originally, actually, it was in a script, and then at some point along this journey, I learned about our Markdown documents, and so I ended up like learning how to use that format, and it made a lot of sense to like have the code like chunked out,
Hmm.
um, and so that helped it uh, be more organized. But it's a long stretch from being like a perfect set up in any way, but yeah, that was kind
Cool.
of how it came about this way.
Yeah, and I know different people have different approaches. Like some people I know love doing like data wrangling in, either R Markdown or Quarto. Some people are very much like I only do it in our script files. So I'm always just curious. I don't think there's a right or wrong way. I'm always just curious why
Yeah,
people make the choices that they do. Could I actually have you go to the very top of it before
sure.
we get to this? And again, if you just want to walk through it like super, super high level, like, first we're like bringing in this data, and we don't have to go through all of it because I know it's a very long script file,
It is.
but just, yeah, some of the main highlights would be good.
Okay. So in this first chunk, loading my libraries, as one does, and some like option-y settings. Um, this chunk here, this one I don't actually run every time I run the script. Um, this is pulling in micro data from the census downloaded. It's incredibly large, and I think there is a way to do this through Tidy Census, but I haven't experimented with it yet. So, admittedly, I went about it this way.
Mhm.
I think it was,
But that's a good example. Like you're bringing
yeah.
in data, in this case, that you have locally, which you're going to combine with data that you're going to get from the Census Bureau.
Yep. Yep, exactly. And so this is, picking out specific variables from that data set that I was really interested in. So it's like household level data, person level response data, and just picking out these like specific variables here that I really was interested in because these were ultimately how we could define who was eligible, which households were eligible for this program based on these
Mm-hmm.
other data sources.
Uh-huh.
Um, so that's generally what this section is, and then it's summarizing this at a state level to help us create an estimate at the state level about. Well, this was like an adjustment factor thing, which was like a whole separate part of this eligibility calculation that I don't remember enough of at this moment to go
It's
into.
okay. No problem.
um, let's see. And so in this next section, we're loading in all the other data from like the ACP data tracker, which was the FCC's website. Um,
ACP is Affordability Connectivity Program.
yes, yep. Um, that is the short version of it, or the acronym. And I had this spreadsheet. There was another person I was collaborating with this on in terms of like collecting the data, and so we started to put some of the like web table data into a spreadsheet that we both maintained, and so
Okay.
this is where I'd pull those things in because they had web tables on a couple different pages, or yeah,
Yeah.
pages on the site. What else? What else? We had Crosswalk. I don't know if you've ever heard of this before, but this was a new thing to me, where it allows you to convert one geography to another,
Hmm.
and or convert geographies from one time period to another.
Huh.
Uh, so we had to do some of that at one point because they share the data. Initially, they were only sharing it in zip code and county, but zip code doesn't really play well with most other
Yes.
geographies. So,
I mean, I know not everybody listening to this will be a super GIS nerd, but for those who are, I'm sure everybody right now is kind of rolling their eyes knowing that everyone, non-GIS people assume, oh yeah, you can easily map, zip code to county, no problem, and it doesn't work like
yeah,
that.
it's like very, different data types trying to match them to be the same thing. They don't.
Exactly. Exactly.
Um, let's see. Yeah, pulling in the enrollment data for zip codes by counties, the claims, the different claims spreadsheets. Uh, yeah, there was one for every year. Um, and then I ended up making like a compiled file that we shared on Git so other folks would not have to go through this
Uh-huh.
annoying process.
Yeah.
Uh, and then
And
this
so
is,
up to this point, it seems like you've worked with all the files you've worked with are files that you have locally. I mean, you obviously
mhm.
get them from other places, but then you bring them in locally, load them into R, and do some basic data wrangling on them.
Yeah, I found because I had in some other previous projects, I had figured out how to like automate some downloads and stuff through R, but
Mm,
then links would break during
yeah,
like their end of the updates and stuff. So it just seemed a little more safe and less hassle for me to worry about that every time.
sure, that makes sense.
Um, and let's see, I know this was part of like a specific data request that I had. Because over time, folks learned that we had all this data like put together and organized and the eligibility estimates created. So I also started to get requests for those things, so people could do their own kind of work with
Cool.
it. And also putting uh, these were some like little helper tables for myself that I pulled in that I had created outside of R. I'm probably offending some very dedicated R users in the world
It's okay.
by looking at all of this.
Well, one thing
Um,
I wanted to mention, so like on line 188, that's the first place I see. I know that function ZCTAs from Tidy Census, or no, sorry, that's from the Tigris
Tigris.
package.
Yep.
So you're bringing in data on ZCTAs, which for normal people, basically zip codes, right? And
Mhm.
then which I assume you're going to use later for some kind of mapping. Well, I know you're not doing the mapping, some kind of analysis purposes. Is that right?
I actually did use it for mapping. I
Oh,
kind of
okay.
use it for both, yeah. So yeah, loading it in here, I can then join it with my finalized zip code analysis later on, and then I can directly write it to my spatial database in ArcGIS.
Okay.
So it's a kind of a
Cool.
combination, yeah.
Got it.
And this was like this little section here was creating some, taking the like all that data I just downloaded basically and creating some national level statistics, just like really basic like summary info about enrollment and
Hmm.
kind of like breakdown by tribal or non-tribal lands, and and it also added in a like month count, which was helpful ultimately. And I have a prediction model towards the very end of the script, which um, wildly kind of to me. I used just a simple linear model to predict when the fund would run out because that was like the big
Mm.
overarching question
Yeah, yeah.
everyone wanted to know. And we were actually right. We used
Oh,
just
wow.
like the observed enrollment data and used that to predict when it would use up all
Yeah.
14 billion, and it was the spring of this year. And
Interesting.
I mean, I feel like that's a not the greatest thing to be like right about, but
Sure.
I was like, yes, my math was right.
But the funding ran out.
Yeah.
Cool.
Um,
Well, I know you're almost to the chunk that we talked about before about having you actually kind of like show what it does. So do you want to, in the next chunk, just kind of walk us through
yeah.
what that looks like?
All right. So this one gets a little bit more into the like nitty-gritty of determining eligibility for a given household. And in this chunk, we're focused at the state level. And so in this little bit here, I've split up the United States into generally like three regions. So we have the lower 48, which is these first two variables, and then Alaska is the next two, and then Hawaii.
Mm.
Uh, and the point of doing that is because the federal poverty level, which was a big factor in determining eligibility, varies greatly between those regions. And so
Sure.
Alaska and Hawaii have their own separate values. And I wanted our estimate to be able to vary based on which state we were focused on. And so I pulled these values out of, and I thankfully at some point pasted this link in here after losing it many times. And that has like a PDF of the different poverty levels based on the number of people in the household. And so that this value for each of these, the P1 is the one person household value. And then the
Mm.
second, P2, is the value for each additional person added in a household.
Okay.
Um, and so these next three sections here are all pretty similar. This is getting into using tidy census. I'm pulling data from the American Community Survey, their 5-year survey, um, uh, at the state level, and focused on this is the population table. Um, this was at the time was the most recent year they had. And we're downloading it without the geography because for this
Mm-hmm.
part we don't need the spatial attributes to come in. And so we're pulling out average household income levels, number of households, and household size, again at the state level. And then down below here is where we start to combine all that to um, get an understanding of how many households are actually eligible. Um, so let's see, we're joining this income levels data set with a table that was earlier. These are actually, can show this quick. This was like a little helper table I made for myself because the variables in tidy census are just they're coming from the Census Bureau and they're just numeric alpha codes that are
Right.
like, you know, not intuitive to understand. And
Yes.
so I just wanted to like set up this table because it establishes like what the maximum income level is within each of these range because they're representing ranges ultimately. Um, and I wanted to set that max threshold. And uh, so going through here, let's see, because I don't want to take up too much time on not important stuff. Um, so here's where we get into, so we've done the join up here, and then we're using that region uh, definition or returning to the region definition. Here's where we're actually setting it as a new variable based on a geo ID that is in this income table. And if
Mm-hmm.
it is 2, then it set it as Alaska. If it's 15, then set the region as Hawaii.
Right.
Otherwise, I call this lower 48.
Uh-huh.
And then we're bringing in the household size data. And for cases where we're saying, or for cases where there's an NA and no value. We're using an average
Mm.
size that we pulled for that point in time. And let's see. And then this is where we start to apply that like more nuanced state level, federal
Uh-huh.
poverty level. So in this calculation, we're saying um, this is that like one person household size, and then multiply this second person or additional person factor by the household size minus the first person.
Mm-hmm.
So it ultimately calculates that for each state based on which region they're grouped in. Um, then we create this like more generalized FPL field, which takes all that information and regardless of which
Right.
region they're in, and we can then get rid of those specific region ones and then compare the FPL value that we've gotten to that um, max income field that we got from this
Uh-huh.
table before. So in cases where the FPL, that poverty level, is greater than or equal to this value, then we're saying, um, yes, this
They are
this
eligible.
record includes households that could be eligible. And then we do this for a few more steps. We're getting rid of this variable because this was like an overarching, this is
Mm-hmm.
not one we wanted to include, and just kind of like filtering down to get to the point where we just have eligible household records. And then we finally summarize it, and we should have, in theory, an estimate for each state. Of course, it doesn't run. I forgot I didn't run these ones before we got on. Do, do, do. Okay. All right. So we're looking for income state two. And there we go. So
And
this is
so that is the HH qualify variable represents
this
what
is
exactly?
telling us the number of households in a
Mm.
given state that are eligible. In this case, just based on income level.
Got it. Okay. That makes sense.
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's actually a good place to stop because I think that what that
Okay.
shows is like how, you're not doing anything mind blowing here. I mean, no
No.
offense, but
No,
it's
no,
it's
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 that's
like nuts
exactly
and
it.
bolts, daily, I mean the functions, select, mutate,
Hmm.
summarize, like it's the kind of thing that all of us have in our code. And I think it's a good example of how even I say even with that, more kind of like basic stuff, you can really have a big impact. So let's actually have you at this point maybe stop sharing your screen because I want to ask you some more sort of general questions. So what's the value in doing this in R versus, I imagine an Excel user could look at that and be like, well, I could do that same thing in Excel. Why do it in R? What did that get you?
And I have seen people work with these data in Excel, and my justification for doing this in R, even so sometimes it would take me a little longer to like troubleshoot code and things like that, is that it's repeatable
Hmm.
and, I'm not altering the data necessarily in any way. I'm just bringing them in and then, I edit the code and the script, but I'm not actually altering the numbers in the cells as I'm going along. And I'm not a proficient Excel user, so maybe there
Sure.
are like more nuanced ways to go about it these days. But yeah, I find it ultimately is much easier to repeat running the script than having to go in and like manually type in and edit cell level things. Um,
Because you also did tell me that you had to rerun this regularly, right? Like it wasn't just a one-time thing, correct?
Right. Yeah. So they were updating some data sets monthly. The national data were updated each week. So our kind of happy medium was to do it like twice a month.
Okay. Yeah. And so if you're, having to do this every other week, you don't want to have to do that manually every time. Having
Right.
your R code allows you to just rerun that and have it, give the updated results. Because in the end, like what you produced was data that was then used in the Tableau dashboard, right? Like that was the kind of end
Hmm.
result of that giant R Markdown document that you showed. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. The end of the script, it puts together, it like edits. I think it was like there's a Google Sheets package or something like that. And so I would just update that every time I did this, and that would be the workbook that we'd use to feed Tableau.
Cool. And I think that's a really good example of how you don't have to use R for everything. I mean, I think sometimes people
Hmm.
get really wrapped up on like, well, if I can't do, every single step, then maybe I won't do it in R. But tackled one piece of this, which was the data wrangling. And, for the reasons that you just mentioned, found R to be really helpful for that piece of it, and then use Tableau for the actual presentation of the dashboard. So that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
Um, Talk to me about how popular this dashboard got and kind of how you ended up speaking to folks at the White House.
Yeah. I I was not expecting it to get as popular as it was. I was still really new in my role when we were working on this initially, and so I had no idea like that was possible, I guess. But it started getting really widely shared in other, like in our advocacy community. So we were sharing it on our podcast. Talking about it a lot. We handed out like little postcards at a national conference that we went to. And a lot of people were like, "Oh, you guys made the dashboard," when we were there. And I was like, "Oh, wow, what's happening?" Didn't recognize that this would be something to be known for, I guess. But yeah, and people were like thanking us, and it was really wild, and it was really nice to like hear that it was so useful for people, because like I mentioned, the folks that were trying to figure out where in their community they need to go focus their efforts to get people enrolled, they could use this to look at the zip code level and say this area has really low enrollment relative to what it could be, and so we should figure out what we can do there to get people enrolled. And that, at the end of the day, it really felt good to be able to help with something like that. And then, yeah, at the policy level, it started getting shared with like different like offices in Congress. And then once folks finally started to push for the funding to like for the program to be refunded, um, there were like letters going amongst congressmen, and this was getting cited in there, and it was in a Senate committee hearing, and so yeah, it was wild, very exciting to
Yeah.
have
And then
something like this.
I know when they were working on trying to get additional funding for this program, folks at the White House actually contacted you to speak to them. Can you talk about what that was?
Yeah, so when there was a need for like an actual number to pitch to Congress to refund this program, numbers started floating around, and the White House finally came out with the number of $6 billion, and we had predicted it would actually take around 7 billion at the current enrollment rate. And I had a friend at ACLU who's like, well, you know, I'm telling them this isn't enough, but they are going to better listen to someone who's actually working with these data. And so, would you be willing to talk with them and explain your numbers to them? And sure enough, that day, I was on a call with them, and they did not listen. But I mean, they listened, but did they take my advice? No.
Well, you can only do so much, right?
Right,
Yes. Well, that's exciting. I mean, even if they didn't take your advice in the end, just seeing the impact that it had both in the advocacy community as well as ultimately getting the attention of folks in the White House is impressive. So I'm curious, now when you reflect on this, what would you say you learned through the process of creating this affordable connectivity program dashboard?
Well, you kind of already touched on this, but I'll just reiterate that it's okay not to do things perfectly. Like, I will jokingly like call out a lot of things that are wrong with this script and how I use GitHub. Like, this is available on GitHub for folks that are interested. But You know, I as someone who isn't using R in, like, the most perfect way, like, I feel allergic to functions,
Hmm.
um, and other things, like, I'm still learning, and I want folks who are also still in that learning phase to feel comfortable to, like, put their work out there, even if it's not perfect, because if you don't actually do it, it's never going to get done, whether or not it's perfect. So, do it imperfectly, do it scared, and you might be really successful at it in the end. And then just also, like, we've used a variety of tools because that's what we had available to us. It also allowed us to be like, for me not to work alone on this. I had,
Hmm.
my team members that were able to help with certain aspects of this, like designing the Tableau interface. I didn't do that part. And so that allowed us to work together. Whereas if I had only done this in R, it would have been all on me. And
Right.
who knows if this would actually have gone anywhere, because I would have had to learn how to make a dashboard in R, which
Yeah.
was daunting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good place to leave it. So, Christine, thank you again for joining me and sharing about your work on this dashboard. It's really inspiring.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you for the invite.
That's it for today's episode. I hope you learned something new about how you can use R. Do you know anyone else who might be interested in this episode? Please share it with them. If you're interested in learning R, check out R for the Rest of Us. We've got courses to help you no matter whether you're just starting out with R or you've got years of experience. Do you work for an organization that needs help communicating effectively with data? Check out our consulting services at rfortherestofus.com/consulting. We work with clients to make high-quality data visualization, beautiful reports made entirely with R, interactive maps, and much, much more. And before we go, one last request. Do you know anyone who's using R in a unique and creative way? We're always looking for new guests for the R for the Rest of Us podcast. If you know someone who would be a good guest, please email me at david@rfortherestofus.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.